Welcome and good evening. Thank you for having me tonight, Mayor, City Council, Acting City Administrator, and members of the public. It is my great pleasure to introduce, through the course of our time together, Ann Arbor's new carbon neutrality plan in its draft living format, as well as the Office of Sustainability and Innovation's fiscal year 21 budget request. My name is Missy Stoltz, and I have the great honor of being the head of the Office of Sustainability and Innovations at the City of Ann Arbor. Thank you for taking time. For tonight, what I want to do before I jump into any more context is I'd like to just appreciate a number of people who've been absolutely positively instrumental in getting us to this point. First and foremost, I want to thank the exceptional staff in the Office of Sustainability and Innovations who've been working tirelessly for over 4 months on this strategy. It has been intense, it has been a heavy lift, and they have done a Herculean job of stepping up. Thanks to each and every one of you for the time and effort you've put in. It's an honor to work with you. I also want to thank a number of city staff. In particular, I want to acknowledge the formidable Raymond Hess, our transportation manager, who has really been instrumental in helping us think holistically about mobility-based solutions. He's been facilitating a bunch of the work that we've done as part of our carbon neutrality effort. I also want to acknowledge Julius Alexander, who is an IT specialist at the city and has helped us remove barriers, especially technological barriers to the work that we're trying to do, especially as we scaled up quickly to launch this carbon neutrality work. I want to acknowledge Zach Wass-Smith from Community Services, who volunteered countless hours of his time to help us at public events, to help gather input from non-traditional stakeholders into this process. He went above and beyond, and we appreciate and acknowledge that contribution. And I'd like to acknowledge Christine Chopuri as the mayor's assistant. She donated extra time, both professionally and personally, to help us move this work forward. Your contribution is duly noted and greatly appreciated. I also want to acknowledge the dozens of city staff who participated, lent their expertise, their insights, and their ideas into this project. Every service area, every unit within the city has been represented in the carbon neutrality planning work. So thank you all for making this a really intentional and purposeful part of your work. We've had over 80 technical advisors, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, but I want to acknowledge them as well as our partner organizations for the time and the effort and the expertise they lent to this process. Without them, it really wouldn't have been possible. And of course, we have to thank all of the members of the public that engaged in this process. We interacted with thousands of members of the public as part of this effort, and their contribution has been instrumental in helping us think about and shaping the work that I'm about to present to you. And we certainly relied heavily on peer communities, both for their expertise, but also their support in this process as we've moved forward. And so to all of them, we say a heartfelt thank you. So to get us started, just want to remind us of how we got to this point. And I'm not going to read this. This is the council resolution that was unanimously passed on November 4th of last year, 2019, directing the city, declaring a climate emergency, and then directing the city to undertake a carbon neutrality planning process that was extensive and would help us figure out how we could achieve carbon neutrality as an entire community by the year 2030. This was the task, and that is basically what organized us and launched us as an Office of Sustainability and Innovations to create A20. A20 is the tag, it is the brand, it is the campaign and the initiative under which all of our work falls. So our plan that I'm about to present after I go through our process is the A20 Carbon Neutrality Plan. As part of the packet that Council had received in advance of this meeting, you get the first draft of this plan. It is not designed, of course, it is a draft. This will always be a living plan in that we will continue to iterate and grow and learn from what's working and what's not. But we wanted to share this with you as soon as possible. Far more detail about the things I'm going to present are in that document. There are also a lot of behind the scenes documents that help with things like the quantifications. And those are also really formative into our thinking in this process. And then of course you have a copy of this slide deck as part of your packet. Before I jump into the process in excruciating detail, I do want to take a minute and talk about what it means to achieve carbon neutrality. I think we all know this, but I think it's worth reiterating. This will be hard. This will require funding. This will require changes in land use and how we develop and how we think about our place. It's going to necessitate coordination across geopolitical boundaries and with every sector that exists within our community and outside of our community. Carbon neutrality for Ann Arbor cannot stop at our political borders. It necessitates that we work in the surrounding region, that we work with our state, that we work with other states. This is an enormous undertaking that we are about to embrace. It means that we have to prioritize passive and active transit, and that means prioritizing them over vehicular traffic if we're really serious about carbon neutrality. And it means all of us, both individually and collectively, will have changes in our life and in our behaviors. And those changes in some ways are on par with what we're experiencing right now with the COVID-19 outbreak. On the other side, carbon neutrality will save lives. It will increase the quality of life. It will enhance public health. We won't have air quality, poor air quality days on par with what we have now. We will fundamentally shift our relationship with our people and our place. We will solidify our role as a national and international leader if we are serious about carbon neutrality. And we will stimulate new markets and opportunities that I think we can't even imagine at this moment in time. This will be hard. And I think we have to be honest about that. And this will necessitate really tough choices and decisions. I happen to think that's a worthwhile endeavor, but I am biased in this conversation. So I wanted to start with that so that we understand kind of where we're headed as I present to you the planning process and then the final carbon neutrality strategy. So the charge, what was it we were asked to do? We complete a greenhouse gas inventory on regular intervals, and this measures the emissions that come out of our community. And we started our first greenhouse gas inventory in the year 2000, and since then we've been doing updates. And our last fully completed greenhouse gas inventory is 2018, at which point community-wide greenhouse gas emissions were 2.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's the acronym NMTCO2EUC. From our initial baseline of 2000, we've experienced about a 14% reduction in community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, which is wonderful. The charge, however, is to get to zero, and to get to zero in the next 10 years. And as you can see, that means we have to shift the trend line of emissions reductions downward rapidly. And that's what we're trying to figure out how to do. These two graphics demonstrate the greenhouse gas emissions from our community, both by source as well as by sector. This is useful because as we're figuring out how to reduce emissions, we need to understand where they're coming from so we can be surgical and intentional in reducing those emissions. And I know you've seen these before. The main point is that we have a fairly even distribution of emissions by sector from the University of Michigan at 32%, our residential sector and our commercial sector. When you look at source, our largest source of emissions are from our electrical grid, followed by natural gas emissions. This is just another way to look at our emissions. Basically, what this comes down to is the majority of our emissions are for stationary energy usage. So thinking heating and cooling your homes. 17% is from transportation and 3% is for waste. This, I want to point out, is how we do inventories is standardized. And so we follow what's called a protocol. It is an international standard for how you count greenhouse gas emissions. There are different standards for different sectors and different folks within within society. We follow the local government protocol and the community protocol. So the way we count things is the same way that New York City counts things. That's the same way that Johannesburg counts greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just a depiction, and I'm happy to go into more detail if anyone has questions. We've got scope 1 emissions, are basically the emissions that occur within the bubble of Ann Arbor, if we were to put a bubble around us. Anything that happens in our community, so think tailpipe emissions out of a car, they're all happening at that point of combustion. Those are scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are from electricity that is powering our operations, our daily lives here in Ann Arbor, but generated somewhere else. And then scope 3 are out of boundary emissions. They are often things like the waste that we produce. When we dispose of it, it's going somewhere else within the system and it's breaking down and producing methane. We count those as scope 3 emissions because in the community in which that waste is degrading, it's scope 1 because it's within their boundaries. So this is how we avoid double counting. I do want to tell you and be very, very clear about what's not included in our greenhouse gas emission calculations. And this is going to play out later in the plan when you see the reduction potential of some strategies. We did not estimate the reduction potential of strategies that were not calculated in our baseline inventory. And that is super important because if we did, it would have been a form of double counting. We would have showed value for reducing emissions for something that is not included in our initial baseline. Now, that does not mean that we are not working on calculations and standards for capturing the things on this slide, but it means as of right now, there are not standards for how communities capture these emissions. So what is not included in our greenhouse gas calculations are the embedded emissions of the things that we do. In this case, what I mean is you might be sitting in your house right now, and sitting in your house, there are a lot of emissions that live in that building. There are some that have been sequestered through the wood, and then there are others that were emitted when your house was produced, when the natural resources were extracted. We do not capture those emissions. We do not capture the upstream and downstream emissions associated with all the goods and services that we procure and use. This is really, really important to understand because we know that upstream emissions can be quite significant, but we do not have a standard way of understanding what every single resident and every single business ever purchased and what they do with every single thing when they're done with it. And that is what's necessary in order to create a really robust greenhouse gas inventory that's looking at upstream and downstream emissions. We do not capture the full range of the commute in and out of our community. We are working aggressively with folks at SEMCOG and Watts to figure out how we can change the formula and capture the full range of the commute. But right now, we only capture people in our calculations once they enter the city of Ann Arbor. This is important because we know that we are an economic hub, we are an educational hub, we are a recreational hub. People are coming to our community and we want to understand the impact of that entire commute. But as of right now, our calculations do not capture that. We also do not capture travel by our residents for things like holidays. If our residents get on a train and go to Chicago, or if they get on an airplane and fly to Florida for spring break, those emissions are not captured in our inventory. And lastly, we don't capture agricultural, forestry, and land use emissions other than the value of trees that we plant as a local government. Mostly this is because we don't have a lot of agriculture within our community in order to capture that. It's on the periphery of our community. But it's important to acknowledge that those are not included in our calculations. The next two slides really get at the importance of looking at the whole commute and why we're working with SEMCOG and Watts to update our figures. So just like everything else in this plan, this is living. And what I mean by that is our emissions inventory will change. Our numbers will look different when we capture the full range of the commute. I know you've seen this before, but this just validates what we were saying in terms of Ann Arbor being a hub, an engine where people come. This is really hard to see, but the green in the center, let's see if you can see here, this represents downtown Ann Arbor. This is an analysis that Berkeley, the University of Berkeley did, looking at household greenhouse gas emissions by zip code. And what you can see here is that living in Ann Arbor means that you have a lower greenhouse gas footprint than living in the periphery. And so we know that folks who are living out here, if we displace them for any reason and we get them into the core of Ann Arbor, we actually reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And there are a number of reasons for this. It's because we have a denser development pattern, because you can take transit, you can walk, and you could bike. It's because our housing stock isn't as big as other places, so it's using less energy. These are important things to consider. Now, while our charge was thinking about how to get the city of Ann Arbor or the entire community to carbon neutrality, in truth, the atmosphere does not care where emissions reductions come from. The atmosphere needs those emissions reductions to take place. To the extent that we can put people in environments that lower their footprint by design, because those places are designed to allow for greater walkability and bikeability, we have done a good. We have reduced greenhouse gas emissions, even though it may not be within our community. This is very important to understand because some of the strategies we're going to propose may look like they have a limited greenhouse gas reduction potential because we only count within the city of Ann Arbor, but their potential is actually orders of magnitude larger if we're intentional and purposeful in how we implement them. So just to give a sense for the framing of how we got to the final list of strategies, the first are the values that framed our work. This is the tagline for the A20 initiative. we came up with this tagline by looking at a lot of different initiatives that the city has undertaken in the past, by looking at public engagement comments that we've received through those initiatives, by looking at resolutions we've seen council passed in the last decade. And what we decided in terms of the values for our carbon neutrality work is, first and foremost, it needs to be equitable. The bullet points underneath this demonstrate the characteristics that we tried to integrate into the planning process to make that value of equity really live. So we worked hard on transparency, being community-led and oriented, and being as inclusive as possible. And I'll talk about that in terms of the actual public events we did and who we engaged in that process. The second value is sustainability. The process has to be sustainable. We don't want to create a plan that sits on a shelf. We don't want to continually do planning processes without implementing actions. And so this has meant that the process needed to be living and iterative. And you've heard me say that, and you'll hear me say that again. It's essential that we acknowledge that this is not a checkbox, that the actions being identified are living and will change and evolve, because we can't project what technology will look like. We can't project what brilliant ideas people will come up with in the next several years as we're tackling the climate crisis. So it's beholden on us to be iterative and flexible in this process. And the process needed to be holistic. We couldn't pick one sector or one system to focus on. We had to think about the entire sector, all of the sectors in our community and all of the systems. And lastly, it needed to be transformative. Because one thing is incredibly clear to all of us, and that is continuing to do what we do right now is not working. It is leading to situations where we have crisis, we have wildfires that are wreaking havoc, we have disruption in supply chains, we have pandemics that take off and that will only get worse. We have to be purposeful and intentional if we're serious about a climate emergency. And when we do that, we will transform. We will transform ourselves. We will transform our relationship to our place, our relationship with each other, and we potentially can transform our entire society and how we think. And that can be quite scary. I also think it's a really incredible opportunity. So those were the values that guided our planning process and the final selection of candidate strategies for our carbon neutrality plan. The mission for our work is the same mission as the city, and that is deliver exceptional services that sustain and enhance a vibrant, safe, and diverse community. The vision is that together, we're creating and implementing a just transition to carbon neutrality by the year 2030. This is the vision that guides us. This is the aspiration that was sent out in the council resolution as well. And that got us to our process. So the process had a number of inputs, and I'm going to use a funnel description to explain this, because this is sort of how things fell out to land on the final plan that we have. The four main inputs that we had into the process were, of course, public input. And I'll talk in more detail momentarily about the different ways that we received public input. We had technical advisory committees, that's the TAC on the bottom right. So these were technical advisors who had expertise in some element of carbon neutrality work, and they lent that expertise to us. We, of course, had staff expertise that came into this process. And we learned from our peer communities, and we continue to learn from our peer communities. This included reading their plans, talking on the phone with them, reading other things like Project Drawdown that exists, and really making sure that we hadn't left anything off the table for consideration. In terms of the process, the planning process, there really were three phases that are denoted as circles here. The first in the top right is what we called ideation. And this is where we worked with all of the stakeholders and we just came up with ideas. What would you like to see in the city's carbon neutrality work? What would you like to see in terms of enhancing quality of life within our place? The second phase was then doing a prioritization, an initial screening of those candidate strategies against different values, against matrix looking at things like equity, technical feasibility, public support. The third phase then was quantifying the final candidate strategies that had come out and determining how are we going to do this? How are we going to support our residents and our commercial enterprises in implementing the solutions we've identified? Acknowledging that the how will continue to grow and change, but that we need to have a sense as we move forward. And that's what got us to our final plan. Throughout this process, I want to put a pin in this point, and that is we had 82 working days from when we started until when we had to finish this plan for timing purposes of internal city processes. In 82 working days, we successfully administered 3 public surveys. We had 68 public events. We had 80 public events scheduled. 12 got canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We hosted 2 large town halls. We engaged over 80 technical advisors, and we had 66 partner organizations step up to work with us. This is another way to look at that timeline kind of more linearly. You can see that basically things were happening in tandem. We were working with the text while we were doing public meetings, while we were engaging with partners in our public events. And I just want to acknowledge that the process wasn't linear, even though I just showed it to you on a timeline, that this was completely iterative. And the plan, again, is living, but the process was also living. And what I mean by that is we might have had a technical advisory committee meeting, and we might have had some ideas that emerged from that meeting. And then we had a survey, and that survey informed a lot of what was socially possible, right? So we knew maybe what was technically desirable, but the input from the public would change that and shift it. And then we'd have a dozen public events, which would further refine kind of our thinking. And we'd bring in staff expertise, and the entire process ebbed and flowed and spoke to each other continually. And that meant that what we landed on wasn't an output from any one person, any one sector, any one technical advisory group. It was actually formative because it came from everybody that touched this process in some way, shape, or form. This is just a sense of those public engagement events and where they fell. So we had the bulk of them in the middle, as you can see, with some candidate strategies on the, with some actions on the far end, kind of as we were launching and as we were ramping down. And what's important here is while we had 68 public events, our public events were really strategically targeted at underrepresented groups. So we didn't just have a town hall, 68 town halls meetings where we effectively had climate champions come out and talk with us. We actually were really purposeful about reaching candidates and members of our public that we don't traditionally engage with. And so that might have meant we sent and worked with Meals on Wheels to have our homebound residents have an opportunity to take a survey and give us feedback on paper. We sent backpack flyers home to 11,000 students in Ann Arbor Public Schools, both to get youth input into the process, but also to reach their caregivers who may not have time to come out to a public event, who may not be looking at social media feeds from the city. We worked with the Neutral Zone to reach youth, to also engage youth in this process. We went to the Housing Commission sites and spoke to the tenants at those sites about what they wanted to see in this work. And so we really tried to be purposeful about reaching a broader demographic of individuals to make sure input into this process was well-rounded. We did those 3 public surveys, and broadly speaking, they focused the first on why should we do this? The second really focused on what we should be doing. And the third focused on how we should be doing it. The very first survey got about 270, just over 270 respondents. The last 2 grossed about 1,000, just over responses. And they ranged the spectrum, just like all things in life. The vast majority of people were incredibly supportive of this work, lots of ideas. Again, you're going to see kind of manifest in the strategy itself or the plan itself, as well as refinement of the actions that we had identified based on this public survey and the input we received. Truthfully, we had about 3 to 5% of responses from folks who thought that we should not be doing this work. On the other side, that meant we had 95 to 98% of responses indicating we should be, and we should be doing this with sincerity. We also looked at the demographics of who was taking the survey. I would argue our first survey was a traditional Ann Arbor survey. It fell pretty far from our goals. It was primarily affluent Caucasian respondents. And so we, like everything, changed the process. And we became much more intentional in the second and third survey about who we were reaching and how we were reaching them. And that was able to shift the respondents quite a bit more and get many more respondents. And you can see here what the demographic profile looked like of our latter surveys. So what do we propose to do? I'm going to go through these actions here. This is where we're transitioning to what's actually in the carbon neutrality plan that's before you. Before I do that, the last piece that I want to put on the table for your consideration is that the strategies and the actions that are listed are deeply intertwined. They are entangled. And what that means is this isn't like a buffet where we can pick one thing and then move on to the next thing. That if we remove something, it has cascading impacts throughout the rest of the plan. That doesn't mean things cannot be removed. It just means when you look at the math around a particular action, it's not as simple as taking it out and then we just have to fill in, let's say, X% of whatever that strategy was written as having a value of. We took incredible care to avoid double counting of emissions reductions potential, to understand how things interact with each other to enhance reduction potential of given candidate strategies. That means that if we pull something out, it's going to ricochet through the rest of the plan and necessitate far more action than probably is intuitive. So I say that because I want you to understand that a lot of work, first and foremost, went into what is coming forward. And second, that it is not a simple mathematical, you add all of these things up with the numbers on the pages that I'm about to give. It is far more complex than that. So with that as framing, I'd like to tell you about the carbon neutrality plans before you. We started going into actions pretty early in this process and realized we had to pull up a little bit and we needed to have some overarching, what we're calling strategies that are the framing of what we're doing. And we landed on 7 overarching strategies that get us to 0. The first is that we have to power our electrical grid with 100% clean and renewable energy. There's no wiggle room on this one. We have to power it with 100%, not 99, not 95, 100% clean and renewable energy. Following this slide, I'm going to walk you through the actions that we are proposing to get to that goal. The second is we need to switch our appliances and our vehicles from gasoline, diesel, propane, and natural gas to electric. And we need to do that because now we're powering our electrical grid with renewable energy. And so we're basically displacing those fossil fuel-based sources with a clean, renewable source of energy. We have to significantly improve the energy efficiency in our homes, our businesses, our schools, our places of worship, and our recreational sites. What's different here is that historically, for all of you, I know you've been active in the environmental movement, we've talked about energy efficiency as the first step in this work. And what we now know is that that can't be true, that it has to be in addition to renewable energy and in addition to electrification. And so what we're figuring out, and you'll see in the actions I'll walk through momentarily, is that we're proposing a suite of services that help people do energy efficiency and those other things at the exact same time so that we can get greater economies of scale in our work and really help our residents make massive and rapid progress towards carbon neutrality in their homes. We have to reduce the vehicle miles we travel, the miles we travel in our vehicles, by at least 50%. We need to have a significant shift in the way we use, reuse, and dispose of materials. This gets at thinking about what we buy, how we buy, when we buy, and what we do with that product. The 6th is not about reducing emissions, but it's about acknowledging that the impacts of climate change are already here and are going to continue to get more extreme. And as such, we have to continue investing in enhancing the resilience of our people in our place if we are going to be able to not just survive, but thrive in whatever the future holds. And lastly, we have an other category, which basically gets at candidate strategies that help lay the foundation for these actions and or close the emissions gap. And that most notably is greenhouse gas emission offsets, which I'll talk about at the very end. So these are the 7 candidate strategies. They're the overarching kind of frames that we have, and this is how we found it to be the most useful to talk to the public about the different actions. We have 44 actions that will land underneath these 7 strategies. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through the different actions that are part of each of the strategies. I'm not going to walk through each slide, but we have added slides here for you so that you can reference them in terms of what each of these actions actually are. Excuse me. Also in your plan, there's far more detail about the assumptions that went into these various actions. So getting started, the very first strategy is powering our electrical grid with 100% clean and renewable energy. Here we've identified 4 actions that will help us achieve that goal. The first is called community choice aggregation. This is a policy, and it will necessitate that we have state level support and state level enabling legislation to do this. What this basically is is it will allow us as a city, let's just say it will allow me or a representative of the city to go to the market and say, we want to buy renewable energy that's the equivalent of all of the electrical uses for everyone within the community of Ann Arbor. So we would be buying at a scale that represents all commercial enterprises, all residents, the University of Michigan. And when we go to the market, we can put certain requirements around this. We could say all of that energy has to be renewable. So it's got to come from wind or solar or geothermal. It has to all be new. So we don't want to buy someone else's renewable energy and kick them off. We want to invest in new renewable energy. And maybe we say, and our proposal is that we also say that displaces fossil fuels. So the example I often give when I talk about this is, I personally don't want to go into Texas and buy wind and invest in wind in Texas that displaces existing wind in Texas. I think based on our goals and our aspirations around carbon neutrality, what we want is to go forward and say, we want to invest in new renewable energy that removes a coal power plant from the grid. So maybe it's not in our backyard, but maybe it's in West Virginia, and that has a really significant impact on the grid. So community choice aggregation is something that has to be enabled, as I said, at the state level. We would then, it's an opt-out program, not an opt-in program. So we would give folks the chance to opt out of participating in the bulk buy. But what we have seen, community choice is enabled in many states, including in Ohio and Illinois. The biggest program of community choice aggregation is in California, although New York is about to surpass, it looks like, in terms of buying potential, although to be determined. But what is possible in community choice aggregation is you're getting electricity at a rate that is generally the same, if not slightly cheaper than what we already pay from our investor-owned utility. So this is a really significant strategy, as you remember, because the majority of our emissions, just over 50%, come from our electricity. So if we're able to invest in clean renewable energy through a CCA, we have a massive impact in terms of reducing emissions. The other three strategies are really important as well. The second strategy is continuing to invest in on-site renewable energy generation within our community and tying that to battery storage. So we've launched what we're calling Solarize Ann Arbor. It's a program where we work with different solar installers and different residents to be able to access renewable energy at a significantly discounted rate. And that is proving fairly successful, actually quite successful. And so the goal is to continue scaling that, helping more and more people get access to renewable energy that may want it on their homes or on their businesses. But the third strategy acknowledges not everyone can access renewable energy on their home or their business. Maybe you don't have a roof that's viable. Maybe you have a beautiful oak tree that covers and shades your roof. Or maybe you don't own that facility. Or maybe you don't have the upfront capital to be able to invest or the credit worthiness to be able to invest in solar. So we think we should be investing in a community solar program. And this would be where we basically take public infrastructure, public sites, and we invest in a solar facility there that the public gets to buy into. And then they get credit from all of the renewable energy generated on that facility. If they buy one panel, for that one panel, whatever it generates, they get that credit back, excuse me, on their utility bill. And they pay in monthly to own that asset. Community solar is a very popular strategy in many, many states. We do not have enabling legislation to do it here in Michigan, although there is legislation currently before the state to be able to enable community solar. And then the last one is continuing with our landfill solar project, which is a roughly 24 megawatt solar installation, of which 22 megawatts would come to the city of Ann Arbor, should that be successful and move forward. That is just for municipal operations, so city government operations. It's the equivalent of about 80% of our total electrical usage. And when you tie in things like the dams that are producing hydro, a little bit of solar that we have on municipal facilities, this project gets us to near 100% clean and renewable energy powering government facilities. So we very much want to see this project continue. I think it's important for us to lead, and there are some opportunities potentially if this proves wildly successful and we get community solar, that over time we could open up our landfill solar project for residents to be able to buy into that program, and we could take the local government demand for electricity and use that to stimulate more solar fields being developed. That's something we've been thinking through, but for right now, we have separated these two as different candidate strategies. So those are the 4 things that fall under powering our electrical grid with 100% renewable energy. And what follows, I'm not going to talk about any of these. These are the slides that we put in here for you to be able to reference, to understand, oh, what was community choice aggregation again? You can see here kind of the specifics of that. We have a slide for each action that I just walked through. Again, your plan, the draft carbon neutrality plan, has a little bit more details around the assumptions. In total, though, this strategy, the powering our electrical grid with 100% renewable energy, when we calculate the potential of those 4 candidate strategies, we get a 41% reduction in community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. There is some language up here at the very top I'd like to point out. It says, assuming that participates. We ran all of our calculations assuming that was in, and then assuming was out. So we could understand the magnitude of the university's impact. And as you saw at the beginning, they are 32% of community emissions. And so having them participate is critical for this work. I think that is probably obvious to everyone. It was included in the council resolution that we continue to partner with the university in their carbon neutrality work, which I am doing, and I sit on the task force. And so this presents an opportunity for us to have very, very significant co-reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that meet our mutual goals. The second strategy was switching our appliances and vehicles from gasoline, diesel, propane, and natural gas to electric. And here we have 6 actions that have been identified to help reach our goals within this space. The first focuses on helping our home and businesses electrify and providing the support for them in terms of electrification. So this is, you'll see later, we have a building code 1 in our energy efficiency space, but this ties very, very closely to that strategy. It's looking at what we legally can be doing around switching folks from natural gas over to electricity. Is it incentives? Are there requirements? We don't know. And so we started working with the legal department to ask these questions and really understand what opportunities exist. We're also going to be looking at the building code to see when the state adopts a new building code, what kind of opportunities might be within that code itself. Regardless, this is a suite of things that focus on how we support that transition. Everything from how we engage with the individual resident or the business owner themselves around the utility of this, to how we're working with folks in the market, the contractors, the appliance stores, other folks, to really understand the value of electric and how it aligns with the goals that we have, so that we can be making sure that when consumers go to market, they're actually getting information and knowledge that's relevant. And right now, this isn't happening. As someone who just replaced a water heater and went from natural gas to electric, I can tell you that we went through 5 different installers before we found someone knowledgeable enough on electric water heaters to be able to help us make that transition. That simply can't happen if we're going to do this in time and scale. So we acknowledge we have a lot of work to do to work with the market to get them ready for this transition. The second is around electrifying our buses. This is both the AATA buses as well as the University of Michigan buses. So again, thinking about how we're supporting the ride with this transition to electrification, but also powering with some on-site renewable energy, how we're tapping into different funding sources to help make this viable, how we're testing it in the short term and the long term. This has a lot of value. Of course, diesel buses have emissions that are associated with them right at the tailpipe. So this will have incredible value in terms of public health by making this transition. We also want to help our community make the transition to electric vehicles. So supporting things like solar and electric vehicle bulk buys together. So previously I talked about solar and batteries. Well, what if we wrapped a package together where you could do all 3 at the same time? And this drastically reduces the payback for those assets. Because when you have solar, you're basically getting your energy to power your car, and you have a battery that's tying in, it's basically lowering the payback because you're not pulling as much from the grid and you're not pulling at peak times from the grid, which is when most of us come home and plug in a vehicle anyway. And so there are the potential of pretty incredible savings by doing this. We've already started working with the manufacturers, known as the OEMs, of electric vehicles to figure out what this might look like. But similar to what I said in the first strategy, we also have to work with the dealerships, because right now, many people have told us they've gone to a lot to purchase an electric vehicle, and the vehicles either aren't on the lot, or the salesperson isn't knowledgeable enough about those vehicles, or continues to push them to an internal combustion engine, an ICE vehicle. And so we have a lot of work to do, not just to help our residents get financial incentives to purchase, but to make sure that the market is ready to provide the supply for the different assets we're looking to procure. Of course, the fourth bullet is that we have to do this as well within the city fleet. So we're going to continue to scale up our work to electrify the city fleet. We've set a goal internally of having complete electrification of our light duty vehicles by 2025, and then transitioning as soon as we can the other heavy duty equipment as it becomes viable on the market over to electric as well. We want to help the private market electrify. So in this case, you could think about UPS and Amazon, Ubers and Lyfts are delivery trucks that exist within our community. Be that a Zingerman's bakery truck that's going out and delivering every day. How do we help them make the transition to electric vehicles as well? How can we make sure we provide the infrastructure that they need to be successful, the rebates, whatever may be needed? This strategy is looking at kind of rounding out the rest of the vehicular market to make the transition to electric. And then lastly, I've sort of alluded to this, and this probably makes sense. If we're helping folks do a transition to electric vehicles, we should make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to support them. So this really focuses on providing the charging infrastructure, providing it within our park and rides, at our garages, on our street lots, making sure that we have solar ties to that to the fullest extent it's possible. How are we providing charging and prioritizing it at our affordable housing sites? Are we doing electric vehicle car share programs? These are all things that are being developed and explored as part of this particular action. And just to give you a sense, right now, staff are working to apply for upwards of 100 a grant for upwards of 100 electric vehicle chargers within the community to help ease some of this, because we know that range anxiety is real. And so if you knew that no matter where you went, you were able to find a parking spot to charge your vehicle when you went to work, that helps reduce that range anxiety that people may have and just loosens their constraints around investing in this technology. So again, here's just more detail on those actions if you'd like to look at them. Excuse me. In total, these 6 candidate strategies around electrification will get us to about a 23% reduction in community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. Again, assuming that the University of Michigan participates most notably in the electrification of their fleet, but even more than that, in the electrification of their operations of their buildings and facilities. The third strategy focuses on energy efficiency and making significant improvements in the efficiency of pretty much all things within our community. You have probably all heard statistics that in most cases, a not insignificant amount of the energy that we use is wasted. It goes directly outdoors, whether that's for heating or cooling. In some cases, it's upwards of 40% of the energy that we use, depending on the facility. In some cases, it's far more than that. And so anything we can do around efficiency is wise because it not only saves money, the best form of energy is the energy you never use in the first place. So this is figuring out how we round out the efficiency of the work that we're doing, excuse me, the efficiency of the facilities that we're working on and in as part of our broader work. There are 11 actions here. Some of these are going to look very familiar. They're things that existed within the office's 5-year work plan, and we think they're incredibly important and naturally slide into this space. So the first, excuse me, is supporting a transition to more energy efficient homes and businesses. So this is everything from bulk buys of efficiency equipment, tying efficiency equipment into solar installs. So we know when we host an event within our community on energy efficiency, we get very few people to come. When we host an event on solar, we don't have enough chairs. So what if we just tie these 2 initiatives together so that as you're getting the solar, you also get the energy efficiency work and you can get better financing as you do this. So we're looking at how we support kind of, again, an entire suite of services that kind of get wrapped together to help people do this work. We're looking at updating building codes. This is a very significant action that is going to require help from all of us to make this happen. The aspiration is Michigan will once again vote on a building code as a state. We follow, municipalities have to follow state level code in Michigan. They will vote again, most likely in 2021. And when they vote, they will have the option of leapfrogging. We're very far behind in the building code. We will have the option of leapfrogging many previous years' codes and adopt the 2021 code. If we adopt the 2021 code, there is an appendix in that code called the Zero Code. It's the Zero Energy Code. And if the state adopts that, it will enable Ann Arbor to require and update our building codes so that all developments are net zero energy new developments within our community. We have modeled that actually happening because it has a notable impact in terms of future development within our community. So that's going to require a lot of work on all of our part to make sure that that building code is adopted by the state level. And then of course, all of the training and education of the marketplace, of our inspectors, our code enforcement officials, and others to make sure that we understand what it means now to be encouraging or requiring net zero energy development. The third is making sure that our lighting, most notably our street lighting, our traffic signals, are powered with LEDs, ideally with solar ties. Even if not with solar ties, now that we've got LED and super efficient lighting, we tie those into the community choice aggregation renewable energy buy that we do, and we know that we're powering those with clean renewable energy. So this is pretty ubiquitous. It has incredible value for all things you can imagine. Everything from dark skies, if we're investing in the right lumens. It's got value for pedestrian safety. It's got value for vehicular safety too, and we have better lighting. So this aligns with a lot of the conversations I know that Council has been having over the course of the last few months. The fourth is about energy disclosure and a benchmarking ordinance that we're looking at. What's different here, you may have heard us talk about time of marketing in the past. We have done the analysis, and what makes sense is to come forward with energy disclosure and benchmarking ordinances for everyone. And so we are working on a commercial energy disclosure ordinance. We're working on one for our multifamily sites. And then of course, we're continuing to move forward on the time of marketing. Now this action has no greenhouse gas reduction potential tied to it because it's a foundational piece for many of the other elements. What it does is help us understand the energy usage of the different components of our community, and then we can be surgical and purposeful in going in. We can figure out who perhaps is not efficient and go to them with resources to help them lower their usage. We can bring utility rebates forward. We can help host seminars. We can bring in incentives if we have them. It also allows us to understand who our high performers are, who's doing a really good job in terms of energy usage, and what are they doing? How do we learn from them? How do we elevate their voice and make them the champions of this work? This is a foundational piece that is really, really critical to many of the other elements. And here we've been talking with our utility about making this pretty easy and seamless for our different property managers, for example, where perhaps they could just sign a waiver, and then every year, once a year, we get a dump of their energy use into a system like EPA's portfolio manager. And that gives us a sense of how they're performing. And then we can track that performance over time. The next strategy is a loan loss reserve. We have a loan loss reserve right now for our PACE for commercial enterprises, but what we're proposing here is a loan loss reserve for our low income residents. We have a lot of initiatives here that are going to be accessible to folks in our community that have pretty decent credit scores, to our affluent members of the community. But for many folks, if you are living on a fixed income, or if your credit isn't particularly good for one reason or another, the market closes to you and people won't lend. Or if they lend at such a high rate that it's not actually a good deal. So what we've been talking to folks at places like Michigan Saves about is, what if we start a loan loss reserve where we put money in a bank account and we tell the banks, you need to be loaning, please loan to our low income residents to do this energy efficiency or renewable energy work, and we'll be the backer. That if they default, we have the resources to help cover that. Now this has happened in a few different municipalities around the nation. It's also something that Michigan Saves is very, very interested in. They're effectively a green bank. They effectively provide a loan loss reserve. And what they're finding is less than 2% of low income residents default. So I don't think this is a particularly risky strategy, but it is a strategy that's fundamentally grounded in our principles of equity, making sure that everyone has access to the opportunities we're bringing forward. The next is our energy concierge and continuing community education. This is in our work plans, so probably familiar. This is making sure that we have physical bodies that can answer people's questions and navigate the opportunities, the incentives that are available to make these kinds of transitions. And of course, continuing to engage with, educate, and learn from our community members. The next is continuing our net zero energy affordable housing program. We continue to work with and prioritize this work with our Housing Commission colleagues. So we want to maintain that work and really scale it. We want to work on a green business challenge so that we're helping our private sector be able to be recognized for the great things they're doing, but also support them in the work and getting access to the information and knowledge they need to make the transition to being a greener enterprise. This is likely going to be done in partnership with our 2030 district, which we're really lucky and fortunate to have within our community. Aging in place efficiently is also in our work plan, and this focuses on helping our aging population, in particular our low-income seniors, age in a place of their choosing for longer. This program we have submitted a grant for. It is a co-grant. It would be from the local foundation as well as from a national funder, and we'll find out in the near future whether or not we are one of the finalists for that grant. But this would help us work with folks like Meals on Wheels and social service organizations to be able to do energy efficiency improvements in homes for seniors that are getting other social services. Things like help widening their hallways so that wheelchairs can get through. When we're installing grab bars, anytime we're doing physical work on a house, we see that as an opportunity to do energy efficiency improvements as well, help those seniors lower their energy bills, which provides more capital for them to be able to invest in medical bills or transit or whatever other needs that they have. And then lastly, we're proposing an expansion of our weatherization program. Weatherization is provided in Washtenaw County through the county through community and economic development. And there are requirements around weatherization dollars and who is able to access those dollars. And it is folks at the 200% federal poverty level or lower. We know, however, in Ann Arbor that you could be living in the equivalent of poverty and be low income and make more than that because the cost of living is higher here. And so how do we expand that program to be able to serve our working poor? And so this is an initiative we've already started talking to the county about, and we are really excited about the opportunity to scale this up to make sure, again, everyone has access to the types of programs and initiatives that we're putting out as part of this plan. So combined, again, these 11 actions are detailed here. The summary for these, combined, these actions have a 14% greenhouse gas reduction potential. And you'll notice that a number of these aren't calculated. You don't see 11 slices of the pie here because many of those strategies, the value of them was calculated in other areas. And so this is a case in point where double counting would have happened if we didn't, if we tried to calculate the value of all of them independently. The fourth strategy is reducing the miles we travel in our vehicles by at least 50%. Here, we have 7 candidate actions. Excuse me. They are implementing the non-motorized plan that the city has. This focuses on prioritizing pedestrian and active transit. This is about ensuring we have ubiquitous sidewalks and protected bike lanes in our community so that people feel safe getting out and not having to get in their car and drive places, that you could put the kids in a stroller and go on a walk, or put them in your trailer on the bike and go for a bike ride. It's also about expanding and improving local and regional transit. So from a local transit standpoint, this is about expanding hours of service. It's about expanding geographical region that's being served. It's also about things like bus rapid transit, so that we have prioritized lanes for buses to be able to move rapidly throughout our network as opposed to being stuck in traffic. And you can imagine what it looks like. I'm sure you've seen pictures or been to Boston or New York where buses are moving faster than the vehicles themselves because they're all stuck in traffic while the bus is actually moving through the system pretty quickly. This requires prioritized infrastructure to make it happen. But is something that we heard time and time again, especially on prioritized corridors like Washtenaw, the need to have this kind of service to make it far more viable and accessible to folks. The third is focusing on expanding and improving regional transit. As we started at the beginning showing, we are a hub. People are coming here. And so how are we helping them get here? How are we doing perhaps commuter buses that have very few stops and get you rapidly from point A to point B? How are we thinking about, to the extent that we are, regional rail and the role that it plays in our area? The fourth is focusing on park and rides and ensuring that those park and rides have seamless connection to transit. They would have electric charging infrastructure on them as well. But the idea is, if you do have to drive into the community for one reason or another, making sure that you can park and very rapidly get into work or get into downtown to do your shopping, whatever it may be. It's about decongesting our streets. This projection is a 10-fold increase in the number of parking spots we have on the periphery of town. The next is an increase in the diversity of housing that's allowed by right within the community. The proposal is explicit. It is about ensuring that in our neighborhoods, we allow duplexes and ADUs and triplexes by right. It is not about allowing high rises in our neighborhoods. It's not about drastically shifting the culture of our neighborhoods, but it is about ensuring that people can live here and that we have workforce housing and different types of accessible housing to diversify and strengthen our neighborhoods. We know this is really important because it displaces people from having to drive in, especially if we have more workforce housing. Our workforce is the group that's traveling the furthest because we continue to have price escalation that happens and we're pushing people further and further out. So opportunities that we have to pull people in where they can then take that transit system that we've invested in and get to where they need to go. So they've further reduced vehicular emissions. That has a really significant impact. The next is, now that we've got kind of people here and we've got this really great sidewalk and bike infrastructure, we got to make sure that it leads to places people want to go. So this focuses on mixed use neighborhoods, ensuring that you could walk to a grocery store because there's one that's close by, or a bakery, or a brewery, or a restaurant, whatever it may be. It's allowing people to be able to get to the accoutrements that make our quality of life so strong because they're right there. If we had great bike infrastructure, but the closest grocery store still is 7 miles away, you're probably still going to drive. So how do we help make sure that our land use patterns mirror the values that we are asking people to embrace, or the actions we're asking folks to embrace? And the last is a tiered parking rate system where we, the way we sort of thought about this, and this would take a lot of time and effort, and we look forward to working with you on this, but right now at this moment, what we thought about is that parking rates would not be high at all for our disabled community, that maybe those driving an EV get a slightly lower rate, but those driving single occupancy vehicles into the community have to pay more. And this is a strategy that would come in after the other things are in place, or as we're putting the other things in place, so that once we know you can easily get from point A to point B on transit or on your bike, that when you choose to drive at that point, we think you should be paying a premium for that choice because other alternatives exist for you. So combined, these 7 strategies get us an 8% reduction. Now, this is the category where when we pull things out, a lot of stuff falls apart. And that's because the actions here are often foundational or critical to other things, or because our calculations, as I mentioned, the limitations of the greenhouse gas protocol that we're using at this moment is that it focuses only on Ann Arbor. And so we're not able to capture the emissions reductions yet that come from putting people in Ann Arbor through, whether that's through transit because now they're not driving in, or whether that's because they're living here and they have moved from a surrounding community that has a higher footprint. So we know that these numbers are low, but we also know that when we're able to calculate, we'll be able to understand the full magnitude of these particular actions. The 5th strategy focuses on changing the way we use, reuse, and dispose of materials. Here, there are 6 candidate strategies. And again, I would just point out with this one, the way we do protocols and calculate emissions are really downstream emissions. So what we do with waste when we have it, how it decomposes or not. And so many of these aren't calculated in terms of their reduction potential, but that does not mean they don't have reduction potential. It's just that we don't have the methodology to calculate the full impact of their upstream emissions. So here, the actions focus on expanding our composting program. This is something, most of these strategies are in the solid waste resource management plan that council has been presented with. We, of course, worked on the public. We drew heavily from that plan. And what we found is incredible alignment between what we need to do for carbon neutrality and what's listed in that plan. So this includes going to year-round composting, expansion of education and engagement around composting, doing everything we can to effectively keep food waste out of our landfill and put them into compost system and have that actually continue to work for us. The second is expansion of commercial recycling, which has the largest impact in this category, making sure we have the infrastructure in place for folks to be recycling and then requiring them to actually do it. So getting, again, our recyclables out of our waste stream and into our recycling stream. The third is something that we actually have somewhere on the books, which is to encourage sustainable materials in new and existing developments. We'd like to really ramp that up and require it so that if you're developing in the community, you have to be using materials that align with our carbon neutrality values, with our sustainability values, with our kind of ethic and ethos around equity. And so this is figuring out and setting the standards for what that means, and then helping create the infrastructure to educate and engage people in successfully implementing it. The fourth is moving towards a circular economy where we basically have no waste within our system, or extremely limited waste, that materials get repurposed and reused and find another useful life. So this is everything from things like lending libraries that exist within our community already, to tool sheds and more of the sharing economy. It's also thinking about, like we mentioned before, what we buy, how we buy, and when we buy it. Some of the creative ideas that came out from the public are, what if neighborhoods signed up and only once a week got an Amazon delivery? And so trucks weren't coming in and out of their neighborhood 5 or 6 times a day, but only once a week was a truck coming and it was delivering to everyone because they had coordinated. So you're still buying, but you're just perhaps delaying those purchases that aren't essential. Those are some of the creative ideas that we're looking forward to exploring as part of that. The fifth, we heard quite a bit about the importance of reducing meat consumption. And so in this case, what we are proposing is doing education and engagement around supporting the health benefits of a plant-rich diet. It is not about banning meat. It is not about telling people or shaming anyone for their dietary consumption. We don't think that's useful. But what it is perhaps doing things like calorie counts that we see at restaurants, but instead maybe having the greenhouse gas emissions count so people understand the impact of their different choices. The University of Michigan does this in many of their cafeterias. So we've been working with them to understand the impact. And maybe it is significantly reducing the amount of meat that is sold at city facilities, potentially not even selling meat at city facilities outside of perhaps the farmer's market. So we're exploring what this means, but we know regardless, it's important to at least let people know about the health benefits associated with reducing meat consumption and embracing more vegetables, fruits, and grains. And then the last one, again, is not quantified, but refrigerants. It's about enhancing refrigerant recycling, basically keeping refrigerants out of our waste stream at all costs. And this is absolutely critical because refrigerants are significant greenhouse gas warmers. So to give you a sense, when we calculate greenhouse gas potential or warming potential, we use carbon dioxide as the baseline, which is why we talk about carbon dioxide equivalent. Carbon dioxide has a warming potential of 1. Refrigerants can have warming potentials of 4,000 to 6,000 per unit emitted. So anything and everything we can do to keep refrigerants out of our waste stream and out of our atmosphere has enormous impact in terms of reducing future greenhouse gas emissions. So this strategy focuses on enhancing and educating folks around our existing refrigerant recycling program, working with the market to make sure we get refrigerants out of materials to the extent we can, finding alternative products that don't pollute the environment, and so forth. So combined, these actions, again, have a pretty modest impact in community-wide emissions reductions, but that does not mean that they're not significant. They have approximately a 0.3% total community-wide reduction potential. The next action or strategy 6, is not about greenhouse gas reduction potential. This is about increasing the resilience of our people and our place, especially in lieu of the fact that the climate is already changing, that we're already experiencing impacts like increases in precipitation and heat, shifts in vector-borne diseases, and other impacts. And so this has a little bit of a greenhouse gas reduction potential that we did calculate, but that really, again, wasn't the intent of these actions. So here, the 6 actions that we have is continuing our work around resilience hubs and investing in our neighborhoods. This includes work we've already started in the Southeast and work that is just starting to emerge in the west part of the community, where we're working with neighborhoods to really understand what their kind of needs are broadly, what opportunities there are to enhance resilience, what role the neighbors want to play, what the assets might look like. So we still are at the beginning phases of this work, but we see it as a really important part of our overall resilience strategy. The second is about fostering neighborhood and youth ambassadors. Through this process, one thing that we learned is there is incredible latent desire to do this work. And we also know that we do not have the capacity within the office to be able to do everything that's on here and engage with every single person in our community. So we're excited to work with all of you as council members, as well as with members of our community who want to serve as climate ambassadors, whether that's from a neighborhood standpoint and working within a geographical area, whether that's our youth who have just stepped up an incredible force to embrace this work with fervor that is unparalleled. So we're going to continue. We've started working on what a neighborhood and youth ambassador program might look like. We're borrowing from peers around the nation who have similar initiatives, and we're excited to see that take off, basically using a spoke model of engagement. The third is preserving and enhancing the local tree canopy. We know that trees have incredible value for our community, whether that's through urban heat island mitigation and cooling our areas, whether that's through stormwater value. Trees increase property value. They make people feel safe. They clean our air. They're an incredible asset. And so we want to make sure that we preserve and enhance the local tree canopy that we have. We want to make sure, though, that we're thoughtful and intentional about the conflicts that exist sometimes between things like development and trees. And we know that there are opportunities to find middle ground in this conversation. And so what we've calculated here is just the carbon sequestration potential of the 1,000 trees that the city plants every year in the public right-of-way. The fourth is something that, candidly, I wish we had done in advance of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think is essential given the world that we live in and the changes likely to continue coming. And that is working to do neighborhood asset mapping. So understand basically a SWOT analysis in our neighborhoods. What are the strengths of that place? What are the needs of that place? What are the opportunities of that place? And then being able to pair folks together so that we can continue to have strong neighborhoods. Right now, we have pretty uneven neighborhoods in our community. We have some places that have incredible social fabric, that neighborhoods have existed for a long time for one reason or another, and people know each other. And we have neighborhoods where that does not exist. And so we want to really be purposeful and intentional about using the Neighborhood Ambassador Program, as well as our existing staff, to be able to strengthen our neighborhoods. And one of the ways you start by doing that is through asset mapping. The fifth is assisting in assembling and disseminating emergency preparedness kits and plans. And so here we've been thinking about working with our partners at the public schools, the neutral zone, and through the other 66 partners we have to figure out how we're helping people make sure they're ready. Not for if a disaster comes, but when it comes. And again, I wish we had done this in advance and really doubled down on it as a community, but this is where we need to learn and be better. And so we're excited to see this really take off and the opportunities it has for engaging everyone in our community and being prepared. And then the sixth is more proactive, and it's about implementing sensors throughout our community to be able to monitor things like heat and air quality, our waterways and flooding. It's basically giving us continual data and information that helps us understand where we're doing a good job, where things are working, where we have threats on the horizon. Perhaps our waterways are rising rapidly, and that's an indication we might have flooding somewhere on the system. Regardless, we want to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to gather the information that we need to make better and informed decisions continually as we move forward in a changing world. So as I mentioned, these different actions weren't prioritized for their greenhouse gas reduction potential, but instead for their resilience. But we do know there is some reduction potential associated with these various strategies, and that's highlighted here. Excuse me for the cough. So the last set of, or the last strategy we have and the 4 sub-actions are kind of our other. There are the things that we heard about, but we didn't necessarily quantify, or we didn't know where they lived because they lived in all areas or the majority of the other areas. They were continuing our equity programs and work. And what this looks like at the city side, we do trainings with other staff. We work with, and we're continuing to work with HR to make sure we understand our cultural assessment. It's making sure that we're conversational and knowledgeable about equity and the disproportionate impacts that happen from some of the activities that we undertake, that we're thinking and prioritizing the needs of frontline populations in our work. For those who may not be aware, within the sustainability field as a profession, we think about climate as being a 3-pronged strategy. It's about how we mitigate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's about how we adapt to the impacts that are already here. And it's about how we do all of that through a foundation of equity. And so anymore in this field, if you want to work in this field, you have to be thinking about and being trained on equity. And so we're going to continue to invest in our people, both our staff, but also our people that live in this community and that use resources in this community to make sure equity is front and center in the work that we do. The second is continuing the Sustaining Ann Arbor Together grant program. This program, as you know, provides loans of up to $10,000 for members of the community to do something that has a tie to sustainability within the public space. And this feels really critical because we're asking people to step up. We don't have all of the answers. And so the grant program allows really creative and innovative ideas to emerge that we could then learn from and possibly scale. So we see this as being a really important initiative to continue moving forward. We're proposing an internal carbon price at the City of Ann Arbor. This would not be for residents. This would just be for local government operations. And the idea here is sending the signal that we are serious about carbon neutrality and putting a price on carbon that says when you're making decisions, there are externalities, there are social costs associated with emitting carbon dioxide that we do not capture within our system. An internal carbon price allows us to start capturing those. And that fundamentally will shift decision making. It will make certain choices not look as viable because the upfront cost, just the pure dollars and cents cost, is not capturing the full cost of that asset. And so it's changing the way we think and the way we operate as a government to be serious about carbon neutrality. And then the last is greenhouse gas emission offsets. So despite our best effort of figuring out how we were going to achieve full carbon neutrality within 10 years, the answer is it's not possible without offsets. So if our goal is literally to get to zero, carbon offsets will be part of the equation. And we've calculated that on the next slide I'll show you as being roughly 14% of emissions. So everything else I've given so far and walked through will get us about 86% of the way towards our reduction target, which is pretty extraordinary if you consider that would all have to happen within the next 10 years. So offsets would basically be used to close the gap. And the idea is that over time, those offsets decrease because we are able to close the gap locally. We are working on guidance for offsets. We know offsets are not created equal. And so the guidance that we have started to compile is that any offset that we purchase has to be additional. It means that project would not have happened if we did not invest, so that we're investing in something new that's helping reduce emissions. We would like for those offsets to also be about displacing fossil fuels or other greenhouse gas emission sources with something that is clean and renewable. And we would like for those investments that we make in offsets to be in environmental justice communities so that we're continuing to live our equity values. So again, you can see the slides here. I'm now going to start wrapping up and transitioning into the budget elements, but to tie things up, I want to give you a few summary slides of everything we just walked through. So assuming UM, again, participates in this, this is a breakdown of the greenhouse gas reduction potential by strategy. And so basically what you see is it kind of phases down, but again, these things interact. So for example, we could say, if we said something like all of strategy 5 could just go away, the answer is all of the emissions reductions potentials for almost everything else fall drastically if we were to do that because these things interact. So combined, this gets us to a point in which we would have 14% in the other action of our greenhouse gas emissions offset. This is a way to look at that a little differently just by percent breakdown. And these were the summary slides that I gave at the very beginning. This is the emissions reductions calculated, estimated over time. So when we did our work, one of the things I did not talk about is we engaged with a contractor. Our timeline was very, very tight. And so as we got to the final list of candidate strategies, we were doing our calculations and we realized we needed some help really fast to do deep analysis. And so we engaged with a contractor and they helped supplement staff to be able to do a year-over-year analysis of the reduction potential of every single thing that I just walked you through. And so this is a graphic that denotes what our emissions profile may actually look like. We projected all of the activities. We projected the staffing that was going to be needed to do each individual action. We projected policy changes and when those policy changes might actually start and the staffing that would be needed and how it would vary from trying to get a policy passed. That is someone different than who's actually implementing it once a policy is passed, and that's different than who's enforcing it when it actually goes into effect. And so we did modeling and projections in that way. This is a look over time of those actions. And so what you see is the beginning of a decrease pretty much immediately if we start running at these actions with the resources needed. And this is mostly through efficiency. We project a slight increase in emissions over the near term. And you'll notice what's happening is things are collapsing. So you'll see that this is getting smaller, our natural gas consumption as we're helping to electrify, but that we might actually see an increase in some areas as we're purchasing more electricity and as that electricity perhaps is coming from our existing grid that isn't the cleanest. But then what does happen, this notable point in time is when the community choice aggregation we project goes into effect. So we model having many, many years of policy work, developing the legislation around community choice and getting it passed, and that we would go to the public and then we would do our first buy in 2026 with it coming online in 2027. And that's how, because we've moved so much over the interim to electric, when we do the bulk buy, you see this cliff where things drop off. So we ran this analysis, and again, all of these variables can change. We'll constantly be monitoring them, but I wanted to denote that there was incredible rigor and analysis that went into this work. This is a look at the cost per strategy. And again, keeping it kind of at that strategy level, we thought was a little bit easier. The costs vary significantly. I'll note that the VMT reduction, that 50% VMT, is the largest cost. And this is because it's the cost associated with infrastructure. Right, so if we're really serious about bus rapid transit, that requires infrastructure, and infrastructure is always the most expensive element of this work. These costs are also costs projected for things that the city or the city's direct partners like the ride would incur. These are not the costs projected for what it might cost me as a homeowner to electrify or a small business to do X. We're working on those cost calculations, but they're far more variable because it depends on what you've already done. So in my home, we already have certain electric appliances. We already have solar. And so the cost for me to go a step further and get to carbon neutrality are different than someone else in the community that perhaps hasn't done any of those activities. And so we did not spend time at this point in the analysis doing those cost calculations because they're so variable. Also, just to remind you, we had 82 working days to get to this point. And so those calculations just were not possible within the time. We have started working on them now, and we'll continue to refine those calculations as we go forward. I just wanted to show the variation because I know these two graphics, everything is kind of skewed with the physical infrastructure cost from our mobility actions. So this is a sense of the cost when we remove that, that strategy from the equation. This is a cost per year. So as I mentioned before, we ran analysis year over year of all of the actions, modeling when they might be able to come online, what kind of staff we would need, what kind of physical costs there are for assets, what kind of soft costs there might be, and that got us to model this. So basically what we're showing is that costs are going to increase over time. We are modeling, and I apologize, there is a typo here that got lost in something, so I will happily update that and send it back. This is showing mostly the budget that we have now, but we did do different modeling projecting what the budget would have needed to look like to have started right out the gate. But basically what you're seeing is a ramp up of funding. The spike in 2025 is because we assume in 2025 bus rapid transit comes online. So no, there's not an ask for $640 million in 2025. It's indicating that should this plan be adopted and we move forward, we're going to be aggressively fundraising to unlock that capital to be able to put that infrastructure in place. But what you can see is that we're basically getting to a point where we're talking about a $50 million minimum investment per year in carbon neutrality work if we're serious about achieving our goal. To give you a sense, our fiscal 21 budget is asking for 1.3, almost $1.4 million. And so what's projected for fiscal 21, that leaves us a $25.6 million gap in the assets needed to start immediately implementing the kinds of things we projected needing to happen to achieve carbon neutrality. So we're already starting from a deficit. We have some ideas about how to start moving forward quickly, and I'm going to transition over to what those look like now. So the first is around staffing. We did project the physical bodies that are going to be needed to do this work, and we projected the different types of people, as I mentioned, noting not everyone needed to be a program manager. Sometimes we needed code enforcement people. And so what we did is an analysis year over year of the staffing that's going to be needed to do this work. And what we come out with is needing effectively no less than 15 people on standard within the Office of Sustainability and Innovations, or doing sustainability within the city of Ann Arbor. We know that, and it scales up and it scales down. And so what we're proposing is that we close this gap with contractor work and consultants so that we kind of get a steady level of staff that can maintain and sustain the work. And then as it ebbs up in particular years, we fill that with contractor work, or we repurpose other folks for that given year to help within city operations. But what we know is we need to start scaling up staffing to get to a baseline level. So I know you can't read this, but this is what we did. We took all of those different programs and initiatives and we started building work plans. And these work plans are aggressive. And I think that it just needs to be stated from the beginning. As you'll notice, most people are being asked to lead at least 4, often 5, sometimes upwards of 8, 9, or 10 different initiatives that I just walked you through. That is probably not realistic, but we tried to be as helpful and thoughtful as we could about not burdening kind of our city infrastructure. And so we created a work plan. And what this is denoting what it would take to actually start immediately implementing or laying the foundation for most of these programs, because much of the work is foundational that has to happen. And so stars indicate positions that do not exist within the city. We have these 6 positions currently available within the Office of Sustainability. We are proposing bringing on 3 new full-time equivalents to help round out the staffing needs in the short term, and bringing in a fellow, a Lead for America fellow, which is a national program. We have a candidate who's interested. This would be a 2-year fellowship where that fellow would help us with some of the policy analysis needed for most of these strategies. And then having a contract for a Solarize, a person to run our Solarize program, as well as our bulk buys within the community. To give you a sense, we also projected that all of these other people are helping, that somewhere in their work plan, they have the ability to help support the various initiatives that are in our carbon neutrality work. If that's not true, if they don't have any capacity to help with these initiatives, then we need even more physical help. So this was one way that we tried to really lessen the ask for the office. And I know that most people on this list are willing and eager to help, but things change and flow. And even despite all of that work, we do notice some things that don't have staffing support. So getting to the fiscal 21 budget ask, we've included the following things in our ask. We did not ask for $25 million. What we asked for were really modest things. We asked for $50,000 to help with the renewable energy and efficiency work at city facilities. We are working on an energy efficiency audit right now that we plan to bring to council to do a really deep ASHRAE level analysis of where energy saving potentials are within our own facilities. And we're gonna need capital to help support implementing and starting to implement some of those solutions. So this isn't much, but again, acknowledging this is the 2nd year of a budget, we didn't wanna rock the boat too much. The next is the support for the Lead for America Policy Fellow. This is a pretty modest cost. His benefits will be covered through Lead for America. So we see this as a pretty inexpensive way of bringing on some capacity support to do the policy analysis needed for most of this work. We asked for $30,000 for a part-time office manager, which would effectively free up my time from doing some other things to be able to fundraise, because we have to close the rest of this gap. And there is no way that we're going to be able to close that if we're not actively and intensely seeking outside capital to help with these initiatives. We ask for, you'll see the 4th bullet is just IT funds. This is what every person in the city pays into the IT fund for the software, the computer, the maintenance, et cetera. So this just goes with that individual fellow. We ask for $50,000 for our Solarize contractor to help scale up our renewable energy and energy efficiency bulk buys, as well as our battery bulk buys within the community. $30,000 from the general fund to start our internal carbon tax. This is the equivalent of $5 per ton of carbon dioxide being added to our decision making within the city. We already have been working on the entire program and infrastructure, so we know how to do this. We're ready to run. This is just for the general fund portion, and those dollars would be reinvested in energy efficiency work within the general fund. So the idea is that's actually saving us money over time. It's freeing up the money to be able to make the upfront investment so we can save money over time. It is not money that's going to sit in an OSI's account. We're asking for $1,500 to be able to use city vehicles. We pay a fee when we take vehicles out from our carpool, the vehicle pool that we have within the city. And as you can tell, we have to be doing a whole lot of public engagement. And so we prioritize taking bus, walking, biking, wherever we can, but there will be times where we have to take city vehicles out, and in particular, the Bolt, which we helped buy. So that those are the vehicles we take out when we go, but we will need more money to be able to access those vehicles. And then the big ask is for 3 new full-time equivalents within the city. So with that, I'm gonna stop. Just remind you, if you have any questions, please do submit those through the budget process. We are really excited about this potential. As I mentioned before, this is audacious. This is exciting. We are really ready to get to work on this. And our intent is to come back. We welcome your thoughts, certainly on the budget process, but also on the plan itself. Right now, the goal is to come back in whatever form that looks like on April 20th for formal adoption of the plan, if that's something council thinks is appropriate. But we have our partners ready to go and ready to support implementation. We are eager to start thinking about financing and fundraising to figure out how we unlock the capital to do what needs to be done. And more importantly, I think we are just excited about the prospect of actually being the first carbon neutral community. So thank you very much.